Redeemer exists to help connect Jesus to people, people to community, and community to mission. And whoever you are, whatever's been going on in your life, I want to give you a welcome to today's Redeemer session. Redeemer is for all people. And we're in the middle of a collection of talks called All Are Welcome. Thomas has done a great job of showing us two encounters from Luke 15 and Matthew 6, where Jesus welcomes different kinds of people carrying different kinds of things. Jesus welcomed sinners. He welcomed people that were worried and anxious. And today, we're going to see that Jesus throws his loving arms open to welcome those carrying all kinds of burdens. In a practical sense, burdens are simply loads that we all carry. And I've seen it in a few visits to East Africa, that there's women, in order to take care of their daily responsibilities, they carry up to 60 kg of stuff balanced on their head. And it's just what they have to do, the loads they have to carry to take care of the responsibilities in life. And it won't be a surprise to you, but in a 2020 study published by the Annals of Global Health, they evaluated the health effects of carrying these kind of physical loads. And they found that the findings indicate a substantial burden of musculoskeletal discomfort and disability in the population of women who carry heavy loads daily. No surprise there. The extent of discomfort and the disability increased with increasing exposure to various load-carrying measures, especially lower back pain. So what's true in a physiological sense is also true in the whole human existence. We are all carrying loads and burdens that, depending on the heaviness of the load and the length that we're carrying them, they're actually quite dangerous for us. Some of us are under the constant burden of a difficult home environment, and that leads to despair. Some of us carry the burden of heavy work responsibilities, and it leads to discouragement and maybe even depression. Others of us have chronic physical burdens that you've been carrying for most of your life, and it leads to really bad mental health. Others carry the burden of lifelong disappointment. We all carry burdens, and our burdens have an effect on us, whether we acknowledge it or not. We're all underneath loads, and in Mark chapter 5 today, we're going to see two different people who are carrying significant loads, and Jesus welcomes them, and he offers to lighten their loads. First, Jesus welcomed the man burdened by 12 extraordinarily short years. Let's look in Mark 5:21 through 24. Jesus had just finished another miracle on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. He crossed the sea, and one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus fell at his feet. His daughter was sick and near death, and he pleaded with Jesus, "My daughter is dying. Please come help." So this noble, respected, and powerful man went to Jesus with the greatest burden that he had ever carried. Verse 42 tells us that the daughter was 12 years old, and Jairus says she was as good as dead if Jesus did not intervene. And we see a couple of burdens that Jairus is carrying here. He's carrying both a relational burden, and he's carrying the burden of responsibility. This burden of responsibility, many of us have felt it before. He rightly feels responsible as this young girl's father to take care of her physical and emotional health. He probably, as a man of influence, can leverage his influence to solve the different problems that comes up in his daughter's life. He likely has some wealth, and he can sling around his money to solve some of these problems as a man who feels the burden of responsibility. And yet, the sickness that she has, he actually can't fix. He probably has plan A, B, C, and D lined up for most of the responsibility burdens that he's carrying, and yet this one, he can't. No plan B could solve this. The most crushing burden he's ever felt, he has to take it to Jesus. So it's a responsibility burden. It's also a relational burden. The minute that a child arrives, every parent knows it, it's filled with incredible joy. And yet also the minute that a child arrives, a mom and a dad are open to the greatest exposure to burden that they could possibly be exposed to. The loss of a child, the hurt of a child. And Jairus was as he's exposed as anybody could possibly be. The burden of responsibility, it was squeezing him like a vice, and the burden of relationship was pressing down on him and threatening to crush him. And he was out of fixes. So this wealthy and respected man, he took his burdens to Jesus. He laid them down at Jesus' feet. He even physically laid down at Jesus' feet with this unbearable burden. And like the words of Numbers chapter 11, verse 14, where Moses was threatened by a burden, Moses said, I can't carry all these people by myself. This burden is too heavy for me. That's the situation in which Jairus found himself. And maybe you're finding yourself in that moment today. There's a burden that you've been carrying, and it's too heavy for you. We can look to Jesus just like Jairus did. He begged Jesus to intervene. And verse 24 says, so Jesus went with him. Interestingly, Mark has these sandwich encounters where he'll start one encounter, move to another encounter, and finish the first. At this point, a woman enters the story. We're going to see how Jesus finishes with her later. But as he's wrapping up with the woman, some friends of Jairus come in verse 35 and say, your daughter's dead. The thing that every parent would be terrified to find out. Jairus just heard. And Jesus gives these words in verse 36. Do not be afraid, just believe. And Jesus goes and tenderly, with some words and some touch, he heals the daughter of Jairus and takes care of the greatest burden that Jairus had ever known. Do not fear, only believe. Maybe that's a word for you today. That massive burden, the one you've been carrying for so long, the one that's threatening to crush you now. Maybe you can hear Jesus saying to you, do not fear, only believe. Jesus welcomed Jairus in his greatest, most dire burden. And Jesus stands ready to welcome you with your burdens as well. So not only did Jesus welcome the man who had the burden of 12 extraordinarily short years, but here we see in verses 24 through 34 that Jesus welcomed the woman burdened by 12 excruciatingly long years. It's this interlude in the Jairus encounter, and as the crowd is pressing around Jesus, this woman who had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, she had spent all she had, and not only did she spend all she had, but she only grew worse and worse in health. She came up behind Jesus, she touched his cloak, believing that there was power, and immediately her bleeding stopped. Jesus turned around and said, who touched my clothes? And the woman had to come forward. And it says, the woman, knowing what happened to her, came and fell at the feet of Jesus, trembling with fear, and told him the whole truth about her whole burden. He said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and freed from your suffering. So this lone, ailing, and broke woman approaches Jesus with her greatest burdens. She may have been tempted to think, if only I were more like Jairus, if I had the influence of a synagogue ruler, if I had the money and the means that he would have had, I could figure out my own burden. She would have been tempted to think that. But we see, in an effort to rid herself of her own burden by her own means, things only get worse. Verse 26 tells us she only added a great deal more suffering to herself. She lost all her money in her own efforts, and she just progressed into worse and worse health. Unlike Jairus, who publicly approached Jesus from the front, we see this woman come from behind, literally crawling in the dirt to get to Jesus. Not only was she carrying the burden of poor health, she also carried the burden of loneliness and social stigma. She even carried the burden of shame. Her bleeding made her ceremonially unclean by Jewish law, leaving her unable to interact with anybody in the Jewish community. She couldn't even worship God in community. She was carrying it all. And so she crawled in the dirt to Jesus. And maybe the burden you're carrying makes you feel shameful and unclean. Yet this woman still got to Jesus. and you can too. Still, Jesus welcomed her, and he took care of all her burdens, just like he did with Jairus. In healing her body, Jesus also removed the religious identity of shame and the cultural ramifications of uncleanness. And in fact, this is where Jesus' encounters with both Jairus and the woman with the bleeding disorders, these stories come together. Not only was the woman ceremonially unclean because of her bleeding, but Jewish law stated that anyone who touched her became unclean as well. And Jesus took on her uncleanliness. Not only that, but with Jairus, Jewish law states that anyone who came into contact with a corpse also took on ceremonial uncleanness. And Jesus did that as well. While heavy, the greatest burdens that these people were carrying, they weren't responsibility burdens, they weren't relational burdens, they weren't even health burdens. The greatest burden that these people were carrying was moral uncleanliness, and that's sin. The heart of Jesus welcoming the burden isn't just finding a fix to the burdens. The heart of Jesus, when he welcomes you or me with our burdens, is self-sacrificial substitution. He took on their uncleanness and he gave them his purity. He took on the woman's shame and gave her his honor. He took on the responsibility burden of Jairus and he gave Jairus his peace. The desperate faith of the nobleman that he showed in crawling to Jesus from the front, and the humble faith of the woman she showed in crawling to Jesus from behind, both of these are models to us. We can find relief from our greatest burdens, moral uncleanliness, sin, if we approach Jesus by faith. Galatians 3:13 says, he became a curse and we go free. The heart of this whole thing is by faith coming to Jesus, and he substitutes himself for us. John Calvin puts it this way, Christ's substitution. He humbled himself to exalt us. He made himself a servant to set us free. He became poor to enrich us. He was sold to buy us back, captive to deliver us, condemned to absolve us, marred that we may be made fair. He died for our life. He did this in such a way that by him hardness is softened, wrath appeased, darkness turned into light, fear reassured, despisal despised, debt canceled, labor lightened, sadness made merry, misfortune made fortunate. In short, mercy has swallowed up all misery, and kindness all misfortune. That is our self-sacrificial substituting Jesus, and we can go to him with our burdens. Jesus desires to carry our burdens, and even more than that, he desires to change us as we come to him with our burdens. As great as it is to find relief from life's burdens, the even greater thing is that we're changed relationally by each encounter with Jesus. Look at these two people. The synagogue ruler changed into an awe-filled witness of the great burden-bearing Jesus. The unnamed woman became daughter in verse 34. They were changed because of their encounters with the burden-bearing Jesus. Jesus cares about your burdens, and he welcomes you. Relief from earthly burdens only lasts until the next burden arrives, but going to Jesus with our burdens and finding relief from our uncleanliness of moral sin, it lasts forever. Jesus can change us. So go to Jesus, friends, with your burdens, great and small. He wants to bear them. Go to Jesus, guys. He desires to form you as you come to him with your burdens into the steadfast followers that he intends you to be. Go to Jesus. For those who might not yet be followers of Jesus today, go to Jesus. On the cross, he took care of your and mine's greatest burdens, our moral uncleanliness that separates us from God the Father. And he substitutes his purity in our place. So will you go to him today?